Welcome to Story Horizon. I'm the storyteller, here to help you drift into a peaceful sleep tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing stories. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax. Let's begin our journey. Story 1. There's something irresistibly captivating about a cafe by the coast, especially when a storm's rolling in. I remember the first time I stumbled upon the coastal cafe. It was an unplanned stop on a solo road trip along the rugged coastline. The sky was already churning with dark clouds, and a cold wind whipped off the ocean, carrying the sharp scent of salt and rain. I was searching for a place to warm up, maybe grab a cup of coffee, when I spotted a small, weathered building perched just above the cliffs. The cafe looked like it had been there forever, braving countless storms, its wooden siding faded and salt-worn. There was a small, hand-painted sign above the door that simply read Cafe. As I approached, the first raindrops started to fall, and I rushed inside, grateful for the sudden warmth. The interior was cozy and unpretentious, with mismatched tables and chairs, the walls adorned with black and white photos of local fishing boats and windswept lighthouses. There was an open fireplace in the corner, the flames crackling softly, filling the room with a gentle, comforting heat. A handful of other customers sat scattered around, all with steaming mugs in hand, gazing out the large windows that faced the tumultuous sea. Behind the counter stood an older man with graying hair and a welcoming smile. "Looks like you made it in just in time," he said as he poured me a cup of coffee. His voice had a warm, gravelly tone, like someone who'd spent years speaking over the sound of waves. Storm's about to hit full force. I took a seat by the window, the perfect spot to watch the storm's drama unfold. The waves were crashing fiercely against the rocks below, sending sprays of white foam into the air. With each gust of wind, the cafe seemed to creak and shudder, yet it felt like the safest place in the world, strong and rooted, just like the cliffs outside. As I sipped my coffee, a young woman at the table next to mine struck up a conversation. She was a painter, she explained, visiting the coast for inspiration. Her sketchbook lay open on the table, filled with quick, expressive strokes of the seascape and the cafe itself. "There's something about storms that brings out the best in this place," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "The energy, the wildness. It's like the ocean is alive." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us watching as the sky grew darker and the wind howled louder, rattling the cafe's old windows. The storm had fully arrived now, and rain lashed against the glass, turning the world outside into a blur of gray. The cafe's walls seemed to hold steady against the force, sheltering us from the chaos outside. As I looked around, I noticed other patrons lost in their own quiet moments. An elderly couple sharing a slice of pie, a young man scribbling in a notebook, two friends laughing softly over their mugs of tea. It felt like each of us had come to the cafe for a reason, seeking refuge from more than just the weather. There was a shared camaraderie in that small room, an unspoken understanding that we were all part of something bigger, even if just for an afternoon. The man behind the counter must have noticed my interest because he came over with a fresh pot of coffee. "Everyone who comes here has a story," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "This place has seen its fair share of storms, inside and out." Curious, I asked him if he'd owned the cafe long. He smiled, a faraway look in his eyes. "Almost 40 years now. My wife and I opened it together. She loved the sea, said it kept her heart alive." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window. "She passed a few years back, but I keep it going for her. The storms, well, they remind me of her. Strong, fierce, never one to back down." There was a moment of silence, the kind that settles around stories told from the heart. I could see the love and loss etched into his face, as familiar as the lines of the cafe itself. "She'd be happy," he continued, "knowing this place is still here, still a haven for people looking to escape the world for a while." The storm outside raged on, but inside, the cafe felt like an anchor, a place untouched by time and trouble. I stayed until late afternoon, lost in conversation with the painter and the cafe owner, swapping stories and watching as the storm gradually subsided. By the time the rain stopped, the world outside was transformed, clean, refreshed, and shimmering under a thin veil of mist. As I prepared to leave, the cafe owner handed me a small candle in a jar, its wax infused with a hint of lavender and sea salt. "Take this," he said, "a little piece of the coast to carry with you." I thanked him, tucking the candle into my bag, and stepped out into the cool post-storm air. The sky was clear now, the clouds having moved on, leaving behind a sense of calm and renewal. The waves had softened, lapping gently against the shore, as if the sea itself had found peace. I've often thought about that cafe since then, especially on stormy days. There was a spirit in that place, something that felt as strong and enduring as the coastline itself. Whenever I light the candle, its soft glow and faint ocean scent take me back to that cozy room, to the warmth of shared stories, and to the people who, like me, had found a brief sanctuary there, sheltered from life's tempests. Story 2. Some places come alive under the rain, like they're waiting for that perfect downpour to reveal their true charm. The Rainy Day Art Studio was one of those places. I remember stumbling upon it one dreary afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs heavy and gray, the streets slick and shimmering from a constant drizzle. I had taken an aimless walk, hoping to shake off the restlessness that rainy days often bring. That's when I saw it, a narrow doorway with a small, hand-painted sign above it that read, "Art Studio, open rain or shine." Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped inside, shaking the water from my coat as the door closed softly behind me. The studio was like another world, warm and bright, with walls lined floor to ceiling with artwork, paintings, sketches, sculptures, and even a few odd sculptures made of driftwood and glass. A faint scent of paint and clay filled the air, mixed with the warmth of a small wood-burning stove crackling in the corner. It was an artist's haven, a shelter for creativity against the gloom outside. At the far end of the room, I noticed an older woman sitting at an easel, her brush moving gracefully across the canvas. She was focused, completely absorbed in her work, her gray hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her hands moved with practiced ease, adding dabs of color, blending and softening edges. She didn't look up when I entered, but something about her presence made the whole space feel alive. "Welcome," a voice came from behind me, soft but warm. I turned to see a younger woman, perhaps in her 30s, with paint-streaked overalls and a kind smile. "Come in and make yourself at home. The rain usually brings a few wanderers like yourself. Feel free to explore." I nodded, thanking her as I wandered through the studio, taking in the artwork. Each piece seemed to hold a story, scenes of stormy seas, misty forests, quiet city streets, and vibrant flowers dripping with raindrops. There was a shared theme of nature, captured in all its moods and mysteries, as if each painting was a tribute to the beauty of the unpredictable. Eventually, I found myself drawn to a series of small paintings displayed on a wooden shelf near the window. They were landscapes, but unlike any I'd seen before. Each one showed the same scene, a lonely lighthouse on a cliff overlooking a churning sea. But each painting was captured in a different light. One under a golden sunset, another shrouded in fog, another lit by a full moon with waves crashing violently below. As I admired the paintings, the older woman put down her brush and looked over at me, a twinkle in her eye. "You like the lighthouse, I see," she said, her voice as gentle as her brushstrokes. "It's beautiful," I replied. "I love how each one feels so different, even though it's the same place." She nodded thoughtfully. "That lighthouse, it's been my muse for years. It's a symbol, you know, something steadfast, standing tall against whatever comes its way. Kind of like us, don't you think?" I smiled, realizing she was right. There's something comforting about it. She glanced at the rain streaking down the window, her gaze distant. "I started painting it after my husband passed," she said quietly. "He was a sailor, always off on some adventure, but that lighthouse was the one thing that brought him home every time. Now it's my way of keeping him close." The room seemed to fall into a respectful silence, the quiet only broken by the soft patter of rain and the crackling fire. I felt honored that she'd shared her story, that she'd let me glimpse the depth behind her work. The younger woman came over then, carrying a cup of tea. She offered it to me with a warm smile. "My mother says the rain brings out the truest colors. I think she's right," she said, glancing at the paintings around us. "Something about rainy days makes everything look a little more alive." We stood together, sipping tea and watching the rain outside, as the older woman returned to her painting. I could see the love in each brushstroke, each careful layer of color she added to the lighthouse scene. She worked with such devotion, like she was weaving a piece of her heart into the canvas. After a while, I wandered through the studio again, stopping to admire other works. A sketch of an old tree twisted by the wind, a painting of rain-drenched cobblestone streets, a watercolor of wildflowers bent under the weight of fresh raindrops. Each piece felt like a reflection of the world outside, captured and brought to life within those four walls. When I finally said my goodbyes, the older woman looked up from her work, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Come back anytime," she said with a gentle smile. The rain always brings new colors to capture. As I stepped back out into the gray afternoon, I felt a renewed sense of calm, a quiet joy that hadn't been there before. The world seemed softer, more vibrant, as if the rain itself was a blessing, washing away the everyday noise and leaving behind something pure and meaningful. I've returned to that studio on a few rainy days since then, each time finding something new, a different painting, a new sketch, and sometimes even a familiar lighthouse, painted in fresh colors and light. It's become a place of refuge for me, a reminder of the beauty in life's storms, of resilience, and of the quiet art of finding color on even the grayest days. Story 3. It's funny how the smallest things can bring back memories long forgotten. For me, it was an old attic on a rainy afternoon. I'd been helping my grandmother sort through boxes, something she'd been meaning to do for years, but had never quite gotten around to. The rain was tapping gently on the roof, a soft, rhythmic sound that made the whole attic feel wrapped in a cozy cocoon. As we sifted through dusty photo albums, fragile old clothes, and stacks of books, my grandmother pulled out a small wooden chest from the far corner. It was faded and worn, its brass hinges tarnished, but there was a delicate beauty to it. "I almost forgot about this," she murmured with a wistful smile, brushing the dust off with her hand. She opened it carefully, revealing a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. "Letters?" I asked, curious, reaching for the top one. They looked ancient, with yellowed paper and handwriting that was elegant but slightly smudged, like someone had spilled a drop of water on the ink long ago. My grandmother nodded, her eyes misty with nostalgia. "These belong to my mother," she said softly, tracing a finger along the ribbon. "They're love letters, written during the war. My father was stationed overseas, and they wrote to each other every week." She handed me a letter, her fingers gentle, as though it was made of the most delicate silk. I carefully unfolded it, the paper soft and fragile, feeling like it was holding a part of history. As I read, I could almost hear the voice of my great-grandfather, sharing his hopes, fears, and dreams for a future with the woman he loved. The words were simple yet powerful, filled with longing and tenderness that seemed to transcend time. My grandmother smiled as she watched me read. They wrote to each other for years, even after the war. It was their way of staying connected when they couldn't be together. Each letter was like a little piece of their hearts. She paused, her eyes distant, lost in memories. He was always a romantic, my father. He would tuck a pressed flower or a small sketch into his letter sometimes, just to make her smile. As I reached for another letter, I noticed a pressed violet tucked between the pages, its petals delicate and faded. I could imagine him carefully placing it there, a token of affection that had survived all these years, hidden away in this attic. It felt like a small miracle, finding something so intimate and timeless, preserved in the quiet stillness of the attic. We spent hours reading through the letters together, laughing at little jokes he'd written, and feeling the weight of the distance and longing in their words. There was a letter from every season, each one reflecting the changing times. The early letters filled with excitement and dreams, the later ones tinged with the hardship and endurance of a couple who had weathered countless storms together. At one point, I looked over and saw my grandmother's eyes shining with tears, though she was smiling. They had such a strong love, she whispered. Even through all the separations, the challenges, they never gave up on each other. These letters remind me of that, of the kind of love that doesn't fade. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, the light filtering through the attic window, casting a warm glow over us. It was as if the whole world had quieted down, letting us savor the memories we were unearthing. In that moment, I felt like I was meeting my great-grandparents in a way I'd never known before, understanding a side of them that lived on through their words. As we packed the letters back into the chest, my grandmother took a deep breath, as though letting go of something she had been holding onto for years. I always wanted to share these with someone, she said, placing the last letter gently in the box. It feels right, passing on their story. I hugged her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the connection that those letters had created between us, across generations. She promised to let me keep one of the letters, and I chose the one with the violet, carefully slipping it into my pocket as a keepsake. As we made our way down from the attic, I glanced back at the chest, knowing it held a legacy, a testament to love, resilience, and the power of words that outlast time itself. The rain had stopped by the time we reached the kitchen, but I could still feel its quiet presence, like a reminder of the stories it had helped us uncover. I've kept that letter ever since, tucked safely in a drawer, the pressed violet a reminder of a love story that spanned oceans and decades. And every time it rains, I think back to that afternoon in the attic, feeling the warmth of my grandmother's hand in mine, and the gentle presence of the past, alive in those letters that had waited so long to be read again. Some places seemed to bloom under the rain, and the flower shop in the rain was one of them. I remember the first time I noticed it, on a drizzly afternoon when the city streets were painted in shades of gray. I was rushing to escape the weather, dodging puddles and bracing myself against the chill, when a burst of color caught my eye. It was a small, unassuming flower shop, tucked between two larger buildings, almost hidden. The storefront was simple, just a single display window filled with vibrant bouquets that seemed to glow against the dim, rainy backdrop. Water droplets clung to the petals, making them shimmer like jewels in the low light, and the scent of fresh blooms wafted out into the street, a mix of roses, lilies, and something faintly citrusy that lifted my spirits instantly. I don't know what possessed me to step inside. Maybe it was the rain, or the need for a moment of brightness, But before I knew it, I was pushing open the door, a small bell chiming softly above me. The warmth inside was immediate, wrapping around me like a blanket, and I was greeted by the sight of flowers in every possible color, arranged in pots, vases, and little baskets that lined the walls. Behind the counter stood an older man, his hands busy trimming a bouquet of wildflowers. He looked up when I entered, offering a gentle smile. "Caught in the rain, I see," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "Nothing like flowers to brighten up a gloomy day." I smiled back, glancing around in awe. "It's beautiful in here," I murmured, almost to myself. The shop had a cozy, timeless feel, with wooden shelves and a faint hum of music playing softly in the background. It was the kind of place that made you want to linger, to breathe in the scents and forget the world outside. The man introduced himself as Thomas, the owner, and, as he put it, the gardener of happiness. He spoke with a gentle warmth, his voice calm and soothing, like he understood the charm of a quiet, rainy day. "Flowers have a way of reminding us of life's small joys," he said thoughtfully, arranging the bouquet with careful hands. "They don't mind the rain. In fact, I think they look their best in it." He offered me a cup of tea, and before I knew it, I was seated at a small table near the window, watching the rain patter against the glass while he told me stories about the shop. He'd inherited it from his mother, he explained, who had started the business during a particularly difficult time. Flowers were her way of bringing a bit of beauty to people, especially when they needed it most. As he spoke, I could feel the history of the place, each bouquet and potted plant a testament to years of care and quiet resilience. There was a kind of magic in that little shop, a warmth that went beyond the flowers, something that felt like hope blooming in the middle of a storm. Just then, the door opened, and a young woman entered, looking as soaked as I had been. Thomas greeted her with the same gentle smile, and without a word, handed her a single red rose. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, her face lighting up as she accepted it. It was a simple gesture, yet it seemed to lift her spirits instantly. Watching the exchange, I understood that this shop was more than just a place to buy flowers. It was a haven, a small sanctuary where people could find a bit of kindness and color, no matter how gray the day. As the afternoon wore on, more people drifted in, each one greeted by Thomas with warmth and familiarity. A young couple picked out sunflowers for their anniversary. An elderly man chose lilies to place by his late wife's photo, and a little girl picked daisies to surprise her mother. Each person left with a bouquet and a smile, and I realized that Thomas's flowers were more than just blooms. They were memories, gestures of love, tokens of hope, each one carrying a piece of his heart. Eventually, the rain began to lighten, and I knew it was time to go. I stood up, thanking Thomas for the tea and the stories. Before I could leave, he handed me a small bouquet of violets and white carnations. "A little something to remember the rainy day," he said with a smile. "Violets for inspiration and carnations for joy." I accepted the bouquet, touched by the kindness of his gesture. As I stepped back out into the street, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, and the city seemed a little brighter, as if the flowers' colors had spilled out beyond the shop's walls, lifting the grayness from the world. I've returned to that shop many times since then, always on rainy days, seeking a little warmth and cheer. Thomas always remembers me, offering a flower and a story, each one as comforting as the last. And every time I leave, I carry with me a piece of that flower shop's magic, a reminder of the beauty that can bloom even on the rainiest of days. Story 5. There's something nostalgic about rain, don't you think? It brings out memories, like old records dusted off and played again. That's exactly how I felt when I stumbled upon the Rainy Day record store. It was tucked away on a narrow side street, a place I'd never noticed before. even though I'd walked that path countless times. The sky was dark and heavy, rain pattering softly on the pavement, and I was looking for shelter when I spotted a small neon sign glowing in the window. Records and memories inside. I couldn't resist. There's a magic to record stores, especially ones that seem to appear out of nowhere on rainy days. As I stepped inside, the warmth and dim light washed over me, a sharp contrast to the cold and wet outside. The scent of old vinyl and polished wood filled the air, and faint jazz music played from a turntable near the back, a slow, smooth saxophone that seemed to match the rhythm of the rain. The place was a labyrinth of shelves, each one packed with records in every color and genre imaginable. Rows of vinyl in worn sleeves, each one holding a piece of someone's story. At the counter stood an older man with salt and pepper hair, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses as he flipped through a stack of records. He looked up when I entered, giving me a friendly nod and a knowing smile, as though he understood exactly why I had come in. "Rain brings the best listeners," he said, his voice warm and gravelly. "Something about the sound of rain just goes well with music, don't you think?" I smiled and nodded, already feeling like I'd found a kindred spirit. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of records, admiring the album art and letting the music wash over me. There were all kinds of treasures: old jazz records, classic rock, blues, soul, and even a few foreign albums with titles I couldn't pronounce. Each one felt like a piece of history, waiting to be heard. As I was flipping through a row of 70s rock albums, the man approached, holding a record with a faded blue cover. "I think you might like this one," he said, handing it to me. The album was by a jazz pianist I'd never heard of, and the cover showed a small figure playing the piano in a dimly lit club, a glass of whiskey perched on the edge of the piano. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What makes you think I'd like it?" He chuckled, crossing his arms. "Call it intuition. Music has a way of finding the right person at the right time." I took the record, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and decided to trust his intuition. "Do you mind if I listen to it here?" "Not at all," he replied, gesturing toward a small listening station in the corner. I slipped on the headphones, placed the record on the turntable, and lowered the needle. The sound was warm and rich, the piano notes smooth and haunting, filling the room with a melancholy that was oddly comforting. Outside, the rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm blending seamlessly with the music. As I listened, I felt like I was being transported back in time, to a smoky club on a rainy night, watching a pianist play his heart out for a crowd that barely noticed. The music wrapped around me, evoking emotions I couldn't quite name: nostalgia, longing, a sense of beauty in the simplicity of the moment. When the record ended, I took off the headphones, feeling like I had just woken up from a dream. The man was watching me, a knowing smile on his face. "Music has that effect," he said quietly. "It brings out things we sometimes forget are there." I ended up buying that record, along with a few others that had caught my eye. As I paid, he handed me a small card, handwritten with a few song recommendations. "For rainy days," he said with a wink. Before I left, he leaned in a bit closer. "People come here looking for something, even if they don't know what it is. Music has a way of finding us when we need it most." As I stepped back out into the rain, clutching the bag of records, I felt lighter, like I'd found something I hadn't realized I was missing. The street was quieter, the rain gentler, and the world felt softer somehow, as if it, too, had been listening. I've been back to that record store a few times since, always on rainy days, always greeted by that same warm jazz and the owner's kind smile. Each time, he has a new record waiting for me, something he thinks I need to hear. And every time he's right. Whenever it rains now, I put on one of those records, close my eyes, and let the music take me back to that cozy little shop, to the sound of rain on the window, and to the feeling that, sometimes, the world brings us exactly what we need, just when we need it most. Story 6. The sky was a muted gray, draped over the mountains like an old, familiar blanket. You could feel the chill in the air, crisp and biting, a warning that winter was creeping in. I had been hiking through the wilderness for days, my boots caked in mud, my jacket covered in burrs and the dust of the trail. This trip was meant to be a solo journey, a way to disconnect, to be alone with my thoughts. And for the most part, it had been just that. But as I reached the ridge overlooking a valley bathed in late afternoon light, I caught sight of something unexpected. A small, stone building nestled against the mountainside, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. It was both out of place and entirely at home, blending into the rugged landscape as if it had always been there. There were no roads leading to it, no paths in sight, but there it was, the refuge, as I would later come to call it, drawn by curiosity, and, if I'm honest, by the thought of a warm fire. I made my way down the ridge and toward the building. My fingers were numb, and the thought of a few hours out of the wind was enough to push me forward, faster than my tired legs would have otherwise allowed. As I approached, I noticed details that made the place even more peculiar. The stonework was intricate and sturdy, built by hands that knew both skill and patience. The windows were shuttered, thick wooden planks bolted down, a long-forgotten refuge, hidden from the world, offering shelter to anyone who dared to wander close enough. To my surprise, the door wasn't locked. It opened with a low groan, revealing a small room inside, lit dimly by the glow of a fire in the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and herbs. It was surprisingly warm, and the comfort was immediate and welcome. I set my pack down and looked around. The room was simple: a wooden table, a few chairs, and a cot tucked into the corner with a woolen blanket folded neatly on top. It was as if someone had just been here, keeping it ready for the next traveler. But there were no signs of recent activity, only a thick layer of dust that had settled on every surface. Then, on the table, I found something that stopped me in my tracks: a leather-bound journal. It was aged, the edges worn and frayed, but it was clearly cherished. Curious, I opened it, expecting notes from the last visitor, or perhaps a few lines scribbled about the weather. But as I read, I realized it was something else entirely. The journal told the story of a group of travelers who had found themselves stranded in these mountains during a brutal winter decades ago. They had stumbled upon the refuge by sheer luck, or maybe something beyond luck, as one of them had written. The words on the pages were both practical and poetic, describing how they managed to survive on the limited supplies they had, the bonds that formed between them, and the quiet wisdom that the mountains seemed to impart. The last few entries were faded, but the tone grew somber, as if the writer had sensed something inevitable on the horizon. There was one line that stuck with me: "Even now, the mountain chooses who it keeps." I read it again and again, feeling the weight of those words. The writer had signed their name, but it was smudged and illegible. And yet, the line felt personal, like a whisper in the silence. As the evening wore on, I lost myself in the journal, poring over every entry, feeling as though I was becoming part of a lineage of wanderers who had found solace within these walls. I began to wonder what had happened to them, if they had all made it out, or if some had stayed behind, claimed by the mountain's silent embrace. Outside, the sun had set, and the fire's light danced across the walls. I was reluctant to leave, feeling that strange pull to linger, as if the refuge wanted to keep me there, to make me part of its history. I spent the night in the cot, drifting in and out of sleep, my mind filled with thoughts of the mountain and its secrets. By morning, I packed my things and left, the journal still lying on the table, waiting for the next soul to find it. I stepped out into the misty dawn, feeling a strange sense of peace. I didn't look back as I made my way up the ridge, but somehow, I knew the refuge would always be there, a safe haven hidden in the mountains, keeping its stories close, welcoming those it deemed worthy. And maybe one day I'd return. Story 7. The rain was coming down in thick, silvery sheets, drumming on the cobblestone streets like the beat of an old, familiar song. I had taken a wrong turn, intentionally, I'll admit. It was one of those days where every step feels like it's leading somewhere important, even if you have no idea where that is. And just as I began to wonder if maybe this little detour had been a mistake, I saw it. The cozy bookshop, its name hand-painted on an old wooden sign that swayed gently in the wind. The bookshop was tucked between two taller buildings, almost as if it were hiding. Its wide windows glowed warmly, lined with ivy and scattered fairy lights. Inside, bookshelves filled nearly every inch of space, creating winding paths through the shop, each one an invitation to explore. I shook the rain from my coat and stepped inside, met by the scent of aged paper, leather, and something comforting, like cinnamon or fresh tea leaves. The sound of the rain outside softened to a muffled hum. At the counter stood an elderly woman with a kind smile and an assortment of tiny reading glasses perched on her head. She waved me in with a knowing look, as if she'd been expecting me all along. "Welcome, dear," she said. "You look like you could use a bit of warmth." I gave her a grateful smile, not knowing what to say. Somehow, this place felt both brand new and deeply familiar. Shelves towered over me, lined with leather-bound volumes, dog-eared paperbacks, and titles that seemed to call out to be touched, held, read. Some books were clearly new arrivals, gleaming under the soft lights, while others were worn and mysterious, their spines faded, as if they held secrets from another time. I began wandering down one of the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the books. The air was filled with the quiet hum of classical music, blending perfectly with the soft murmur of pages being turned by a few scattered readers, each lost in their own little world. It was like a sanctuary, a place where time slowed down, where the outside world felt 1,000 miles away. Then, in a corner near the back, something caught my eye. A small, dusty book with a plain cover. It was wedged between two much larger tomes, as if trying to stay hidden. Curious, I pulled it out and flipped through its yellowed pages. Inside was a handwritten dedication. "To the one who finds this book, may it bring you what you need." I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. For a moment, I felt as if the book had been left there just for me, waiting patiently through the years for this exact moment. I settled into a cozy armchair by the window and began reading, feeling as if I were unraveling a story meant only for me. The book was a collection of short stories, some sweet, some wistful, some full of adventure. Each story had a little note in the margins, scribbled by a different hand in ink that varied from dark black to faded brown. I realized slowly that these notes weren't annotations of the stories, but messages, fragments of thoughts, musings, memories, all left behind by people who had read the book before. It felt like a conversation across time, a connection to strangers who, like me, had been drawn to this quiet little shop on some rainy day. I lost myself in those stories, reading each line, each note, feeling the layers of humanity in each one. Some were funny, others contemplative. One person had written, "If you're reading this, I hope you know you're never truly alone." Another had scrawled, "Take a deep breath. Things will get better." The book felt like a collection of voices from people who had once needed comfort and left it behind for others to find. As I closed the book, I noticed a final note on the inside cover. It was written in the same hand as the dedication, and it read, "Sometimes the stories find us." I sat back, letting those words sink in. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, and the golden light of the street lamps glowed against the wet cobblestones. The shopkeeper caught my eye and gave me a small, understanding nod, as if she knew exactly what I had found. I decided to leave the book where I had found it, carefully sliding it back onto the shelf in the same spot, hoping it would find the next person who needed it just as much as I had. As I left the cozy bookshop, I felt different, somehow lighter, as if the weight of the day had lifted. I turned back once, catching a final glimpse of the warm, inviting glow from the window, and then I stepped back out into the world, knowing that little shop and the stories within it would always be there, waiting. Story 8. It was late, later than usual for me to be wandering the city, but the night was warm, and I wasn't ready to go home just yet. That's when I saw it, a tiny cafe, glowing softly at the end of a narrow street. There was no sign, no flashy lights, just an open door and a faint golden light spilling out onto the cobblestones. Intrigued, I walked toward it, feeling like I was drifting into another world. As I stepped inside, a gentle hum of jazz music filled the air, wrapping itself around me like a warm hug. The cafe was small and cozy, with tables tucked in every corner, some scattered with worn books and mismatched teacups. It was unlike any place I'd ever seen. Every detail was deliberate, from the old-fashioned lamps casting a soft glow to the colorful cushions piled on vintage chairs. A faint aroma of coffee and vanilla lingered, but there was something else in the air, a feeling, almost like nostalgia, though I couldn't explain why. At the counter, a barista with a serene smile greeted me. She didn't ask what I wanted. Instead, she simply said, "Welcome to the Dream Cafe. Here, we make drinks to match your mood." I must have looked confused because she laughed softly. "Just think of something that's been on your mind, a memory, a dream, a wish, whatever you need. We'll take care of the rest." Not knowing what else to do, I thought about the last few days. Work had been relentless, my mind scattered with worries about the future, deadlines, and a nagging feeling that I was missing something important in life. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting all those thoughts drift to the surface. When I opened them, the barista handed me a warm cup. The aroma was intoxicating, rich, comforting, with a hint of something sweet. "Try it," she encouraged. "Let it take you where you need to go." I took a cautious sip, and suddenly, I was flooded with memories. Not of any particular event, but of feelings. Lazy Sunday mornings, the laughter of old friends, the warmth of the sun on my face. It tasted like home, like the comfort and calm I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I don't know how long I sat there, holding that cup, letting the drink settle into my bones. The cafe seemed to hum around me, alive with quiet chatter, laughter, and the clinking of spoons against delicate porcelain. Curious, I looked around and noticed that everyone seemed to be in their own little world. A young couple was whispering at a corner table, their faces lit up with an unspoken connection. An elderly man sat alone, sipping slowly, his eyes closed as if savoring each memory that passed through him. There was a quiet woman by the window, her gaze lost in the distance, a gentle smile on her face, as if recalling a long-lost love. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just any cafe. This place was a haven, a sanctuary where people could reconnect with parts of themselves they'd forgotten, if only for a little while. It was as if each drink was a key, unlocking doors to hidden memories, dreams, and wishes that had been buried under the noise of daily life. When I finished my drink, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had been lifted. The barista came by, collecting the empty cup with a gentle smile. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, and somehow, I knew she already knew the answer. "Thank you," I said softly. She simply nodded, as if she'd heard it 1,000 times before. As I stood to leave, I noticed a small wooden sign by the door that I hadn't seen before. It read, asterisk, come back when you need another dream. Asterisk, I smiled to myself, wondering if I'd just imagined the entire experience, if maybe the warmth and peace I'd felt had simply been the product of a sleepless night and a wandering mind. But as I stepped back into the cool night air, I felt something solid in my pocket, a small, hand-drawn card with the cafe's name, scrawled in delicate script, the Dream Cafe. I hadn't noticed it when I'd walked in, and I didn't remember anyone giving it to me. Yet, there it was, a little reminder, a promise of a place where dreams and memories were brewed as easily as coffee. I walked home feeling a kind of peace I hadn't felt in ages, knowing that, whenever I needed it, the Dream Cafe would be there, a quiet little corner of the world where dreams were sipped and savored, waiting for anyone brave enough to let them in. Story 9. There was a stretch of forest a few miles outside my town, a place no one really paid much attention to. It didn't have hiking trails or picnic spots, and no signs marked its edges. People just called it the Quiet Forest. I'd driven past it dozens of times, but something about it had always piqued my curiosity. So one autumn afternoon, with the sunlight pouring down like honey and the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves, I decided to finally wander in. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the usual kind you'd find in nature, filled with the faint rustling of animals or the occasional bird call, but a deep, almost reverent quiet. It felt as though the trees themselves were holding their breath, as though every leaf and branch was part of some secret stillness. I slowed my pace, almost instinctively, careful not to disrupt whatever lay hidden in that silence. The forest floor was soft beneath my feet, blanketed in gold and red leaves, and the air was cool, with the slightest hint of pine. As I ventured deeper, the sunlight filtering through the canopy turned softer, casting a warm, amber glow that made everything seem dreamlike, as if I had stepped into another world. The deeper I went, the more I felt the outside world fading away. After what felt like an hour, though time was hard to grasp in that place, I stumbled upon something unexpected, a small, clear pond, perfectly round and still, as if someone had placed a giant mirror on the forest floor. The water was so calm that it reflected the sky above with perfect clarity, making it feel as if I were standing on the edge of the world. There were no ripples, no fallen leaves floating on its surface. It was untouched, pristine. I sat down at the edge, drawn to the stillness of it, and stared at my reflection. My thoughts, usually racing with to-do lists and plans, started to quiet, settling into something deeper, more grounded. I felt my shoulders relax, a weight I hadn't noticed before slipping away. As I sat there, I became aware of subtle things around me. The way the light shifted as the sun moved lower in the sky, the faint scent of moss and earth, the gentle sway of the branches overhead. I felt a kind of peace that I hadn't felt in years, a sensation that reached down to something deep and unspoken within me. It was as though the forest was sharing something ancient, a wisdom that didn't need words. Then something curious happened. Across the pond, on the opposite bank, I saw a figure, a deer, standing perfectly still, watching me. It had appeared out of nowhere, silent as the forest itself. We stayed there, eyes locked, neither of us moving. For a moment, I felt as if we understood each other in some strange, quiet way. The deer's gaze was calm, steady, and I couldn't help but feel it was somehow part of the forest's secret, its guardian or messenger. After a long while, the deer blinked, gave a small nod, as if in acknowledgement, and turned back into the trees, disappearing as silently as it had come. I sat there a bit longer, feeling oddly blessed by the encounter. as if I had been offered a glimpse into a world most people never saw. Eventually, the sun dipped lower, casting shadows across the forest floor. I knew I should head back, but leaving felt almost like waking up from a dream. I stood up slowly, taking one last look at the pond and the trees, and started making my way back through the forest. The walk back felt different. The forest's quiet had settled into me, a calmness I hadn't realized I was missing. I noticed the colors more vividly, the shape of each tree, the way the leaves crunched beneath my feet. When I finally emerged back onto the road, the sounds of the world returned in a rush. The distant hum of cars, a bird calling out, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But that quiet, that deep, all-encompassing quiet, stayed with me. I knew I'd never forget the quiet forest and its still pond, nor the deer that had met my gaze. Now, whenever life feels too loud, I think of that hidden place, where the world holds its breath and a person can listen to the silence. And though I haven't returned, something tells me the quiet forest is always there, waiting for anyone willing to step inside and listen.